Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. It's another guest episode, and on those I lead with the disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against a guest's political views or groups they support. But that won't be an issue today, because this is about how to empower citizens regardless of their political beliefs. The heightened toxicity and polarization of today pose significant obstacles even when people genuinely want to connect across political differences. These roadblocks take on many forms, from the financial to the electoral and to the psychological, and it leads many people to be angrier with each other and even give up trying to build bridges. And people often feel that politics is rigged. So, how can we more effectively mitigate or even overcome these obstacles to empower everyone across beliefs, to make our election system work better, and to make civic engagement less wasteful and more representative? That's what my guest, Travis Misurell, is here to talk about today. Travis is the founder of the Future Is Now Coalition, or FiNC, which provides practical ways that citizens and grassroots voices can shape elections together and seeks to create a level playing field for candidates, citizens, and independent journalists to be seen and heard. Now, let's talk about these practical methods that citizens, including those of you listening, can use to make your voice heard and to more effectively build bridges. Please welcome Travis Misurell. Travis, thanks for coming on. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on. So I always like to go back in time for the first question. So what led you to start the Future Is Now Coalition, and why did you think it was necessary to create this organization? And what does FiNC seek to do in a general sense?
Sure. So for your first question, how it all started, kind of the threads of what it became started really in 2016, pretty much when it was like Trump versus Bernie were the big focuses that I was on. And so a lot of what I saw, obviously in a lot of ways, they're very, very different candidates, but there's also the similarity that they're both speaking in a populist kind of a nature. Um, I'm not here to debate whether it's genuine populism or fake populism is for others to decide, but both sides basically they're speaking to the pain of the people. They're talking about how the system is broken, the system is rigged. To some extent, both of them were talking about money in politics, more on Bernie's side, but even 2016, Trump had the drain the swamp idea. So both were talking about pain points, the true pain points of America, the way the system isn't really working, and they were promising change. Um, and so that really, I really saw how they were speaking to the people. Again, very different strategies as a whole. Um, but then I also saw how being a rigged system, the decision making kind of leaves its. Americans have get to make a decision by voting, but we are kind of manipulated into a false choice, which we'll get into some of that throughout this episode. But I saw how a lot of people on the left, whether you agree with it or not, Bernie was a very popular candidate at the time, and it was polling very high, but the establishment was against him. They did not like what he was for. And so ultimately they pushed the Democratic Party away from him, even though that's what that side wanted. Um, so it really woke me up to how deeply the system is rigged, what makes it rigged about it, how the establishment media plays a part, special interests, money. So I started learning a lot more about how the system works as a whole. And then from there could kind of see on a high level of what kind of the common denominator would be at the core that we could focus on changing, that would have the biggest impact, the biggest turnaround towards Americans' true interests and not towards special interests. So that's the long story there. And then to answer the second part, the general idea is what we're doing at FiNC is really trying to promote a more direct democracy where citizens truly pick their candidates without the manipulation, without the noise, without the misinformation and the confusions and the performative actions in politics. Um, so a lot of what we're doing is really trying to streamline the democratic process, allowing Americans to really make more of an impact with less of an effort, less confusion. Try to, how can we streamline the process that it really just, brings the candidates front and center and kind of moves the drama away, moves the manipulation away, and then truly empowers Americans to make their own decisions for themselves and when it comes time to voting.
Gotcha. I think that's a pretty unique way to tackle this ballot information problem that obviously is rampant in today's politics. And we're going to go into it more later on, but just this whole, where do people go to find this information? If even if they know where to find this information, how can they efficiently use their time? How do they know how to read what's in front of them? How do they know what all the choices are? Because sometimes you'll go to a polling place, you'll look at your ballot and like, who is this person? I didn't know they were running, and obviously there's some sort of disconnect there that we've got to fix. And I like the really practical approach that you talk about there. And even with the whether you think the system is rigged or not, there is definitely a level of unfairness to it that, well, obviously we could talk about how exactly to fix it, but it's definitely something that does need to be addressed. So let's go ahead and talk about more of those specifics of what FiNC does. So part of FiNC's work is about helping people use today's rules of elections and campaigning differently through what you guys call the voter lens of people first versus power first. So what exactly do these two concepts look like, and what's a practical example of that?
Sure. So the people first versus power first, which we're also calling up down politics, is the idea of right now in American politics, pretty much everything the way people see it right now is left versus right, and we know we're not going to change that anytime soon. We're not going to convince people on the left to go right, right on the left, anything like that. But what we want people to start doing is add this layer of up versus down. And so up serving candidates are what we refer to are the candidates that their main goal is to appease their big donors, special interests, the party leaders above them to rise in power or to profit for themselves. Up-serving candidates look at those that have more power than them, more influence than them, and that's who they serve in actuality. So no matter what the voters actually stand for, yes, they have to get the voters' vote, but when push comes to shove with legislation and everything, they're really appealing to those above them. Those are giving them the most money, those that are raising their career, that kind of thing. Um, where then down serving candidates are the candidates that are like truly grassroots. They actually want to answer to the voters, they want to represent the voters. It's our interests that they have in mind. And a lot of the best ones that are down serving candidates are the ones that are taking small dollar donations only, or at least a majority of just small dollar donations. And um and like some candidates outright swear off corporate PAC money and super PAC money, and then there's a gradient of up versus down. But we believe that just by adding that lens and helping citizens understand how to assess a candidate as up versus down, it can really move the needle significantly forward, in the towards true representation, and not just keep us stuck in this current cycle that we're just trapped in this this cycle of just extremes on both sides and things not really getting done that people want, and the kind of the mess that we're kind of in these days.
Okay, that makes sense. Do you necessarily tell people, hey, don't vote for these up candidates, vote for these down candidates, or is it more just you're laying out sort of an agnostic approach of this is who these people get their money from, you make your decision kind of thing?
um yeah, I mean, we're pretty clear that it's kind of like people should really be paying attention to who's funding a campaign. So, you know, definitely we're not pushing left versus right. We do at this stage, we'll say like who's the more down serving candidate, one versus another one. Like we'll even say like Mandani, for example, is the more down serving candidate toward compared to Como. We're not here to critique the policies of either side, but when Donnie had a very down-serving campaign, a lot of volunteers, a very small dollar donations system, where Como was very billionaire focused and that kind of thing. So we just want to be clear that, when you follow the money, it really like dictates a lot of the policies that get enacted in Congress. Um, and so even if you're, a lot of elections, there is no down serving candidate at this stage. But what I would say is, like, so for example, if healthcare is your biggest concern, then don't vote for somebody that takes millions of dollars from private health insurance and big pharma, because they're not, no matter what they're going to tell you, they're not going to be able to push legislation where it needs to be if they're taking money from the industry that is meant to reform them. So ideally it's like go for the most grassroots candidate, but if that's not possible, like specifically match what you care about most to who's funding their campaign and looking for those conflicts of interest. And that's something that we're trying to help people figure out the differences of how to look at that information. And then the ultimate goal is actually to streamline it, build a one-stop shop that actually gives you this information like kind of automatically for all candidates.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting way to tackle it, where obviously a lot of things are focused on what are their policies, but there's like a million different places that go and focus on their policies and tell you whether they're good or bad, obviously with biased leanings there. But even though a lot of people say they want to get money out of politics, they still oftentimes, a lot of times, vote for people who have the money. Now, I mean, there's a whole host of reasons why that happens, but that is an interesting approach to that. And I think it would make more people open to the content that you're putting out there. Whereas obviously, if people are seeing a certain value judgment on a candidate's policies, they're going to be like, oh, okay, wait a minute. Is this a conservative rag? Is this a liberal rag? Is this an independent rag or moderate rag or anything like that? So that's a pretty unique way, or at least it's a unique way to just focus on that. I know some people talk about the money in politics, but they don't necessarily focus in on it as much as you guys do. So that's an interesting way to look at it. So you've said elsewhere that your work centers on creating a level playing field where every candidate is seen, every citizen is heard, and independent journalists can reach voters without gatekeepers. So I want to go into each of those groups for these next several questions, and especially for anybody out there who's, whether they're a regular citizen, whether they're thinking about running for office, or even if they're an independent journalist. So let's go to the candidates first specifically. So what are 2 to 3 ways that you level the playing field for candidates specifically?
Sure. So, in a nutshell, the two main products that we're basically working with is so this digital politics is the mindset, the framing, like this up down politics, like a newer way to look at things, not necessarily by their policies, but by like how they're running democracy, how they're doing elections, campaign process. So digital politics is more of a mindset shift, and then digital democracy is the ultimate goal of a tech platform, basically a one-stop shop that would showcase all politicians equally. It would incorporate their funding, so it'd be an easy way to see who's funding their campaign, what industry is that money coming from, are there conflicts of interest based on what I care about as a voter. So that's it kind of breaks down. There's a multi-phase approach. Digital democracy is kind of a longer term goal to achieve for us. But so ultimately, though, what we're envisioning with digital democracy is, imagine if you could just put your zip code in, and then all candidates are just shown side by side, Democrat, Republican, even third parties, independents. um, the idea is if we could promote one platform that showcases all the candidates, it starts weakening the need to raise millions of dollars. The whole bottom line is that, candidates need to raise millions. It boils down to they need to advertise themselves to the voters so the voters can know who you are. um we're kind of stuck in this system. Like, yes, people vote usually first. They vote either D down the line or R down the line. But then it's very big on name recognition. If they just recognize the one name, that's the name they're going to vote for right now. um But if we start shifting the way we see politics and shift the way we choose our candidates and start building more of one standardized process, one platform that gives every candidate a chance, and then it's really up to their merit and how they resonate with the people, and their lack of conflicts of interest, and are they consistent in their promises once they're elected. um, that's how we want to flip the script here. By just making it less, because not only showcasing all candidates equally, not only are you like giving rise to the grassroots ones that don't have as loud of a voice, but then you're also kind of bringing down the establishment ones because they're going to have more conflicts of interest. They already have all these big donors and all these questionable people giving them money that kind of sways them from doing what they are promising the voters to do. um, so um, so right now it starts with using social media and digital systems as the shared stage, like today's TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, all those things. Is the shared stage currently, but then as we start building this one-stop system, then we would funnel people onto digital democracy, which would literally be citizen owned, something that we're going to actually, like, FiNC's not going to own it. We're going to actually build it with America and give it to America. um, that every American can opt into an equal ownership stake of that technology. Like, kind of the movement has to come first, but like as we get the awareness and enough people power, then we're going to build this system. There's a lot to it, obviously, but ultimately the goal is to showcase all these candidates, build that level playing field. Because again, like, this is kind of how democracy should have always been. It's right now, it's like every man for themselves as a candidate to raise money and run your campaign, and then they're forced to buddy up with others in power and others with money in order to be seen. But like, if America just promotes democracy and a system of democracy, and then we could showcase everyone. It's cheap, significantly cheaper. You showcase everyone, and then money is less of an impact on who wins the election, and just makes it streamlined and easier for all Americans to make a better choice for themselves. Um, so that's pretty much it. So it's a starting with the digital strategy of today, and then moving on to one central database, one central system, as this evolves, and then also incorporating that up-down politics to it as well, and just kind of helping people in a nonpartisan way of how to better assess a candidate. Because it's one thing, like, we've all known politicians are known to promise the world to you, but then how often do they actually deliver on their promises? So we're trying to help people assess, like, well, what are the chances of them actually going to try to fight for that promise? And a lot of it's their money, their promise consistency in their past, like their history. So we're trying to streamline that and make it easier to assess each candidate based on, like, their integrity, basically, of like how good are they as a civil servant versus just playing the game of politics and manipulating us.
Fascinating. So, I mean, you obviously you're focused on, uh, obviously you're talking about making this easier for people to research, but that was an interesting way of looking at it where you talk about the candidates needing to raise less money. Now, yes, sometimes even with a very stark difference in money that one candidate has versus another, that less funded candidate, they might still win every once in a while, but obviously that rarely happens. And even if the spending strategy of the more well-funded candidate is better, I mean, or is worse, just the sheer amount of money, takes them across the finish line. So I never really thought about it like that. That's a unique way to try to lessen the amount of money that small donors or that less funded candidates need, and I guess would also prevent the or help prevent the temptation for them to fall to big donors later on down the road, because I think you also see that a lot too, especially when people talk about themselves being outsider candidates. Oh, I'm not part of the establishment, I'm not a politician. Well, guess what, when you win election you can't say that anymore, even though some of them still try to say that I'm not establishment or I'm not a politician. It's like, no, you are now. But that's a little bit of a grievance I have. That's a little bit out of the purview of this discussion. But So we talked about candidates specifically, how this would help candidates or level the playing field specifically for candidates. So now, what are 2 to 3 ways that you leveled the playing field for citizens and grassroots activists? I know we touched a little bit on it already, but maybe a little bit more in depth on the citizens and grassroots activists.
Yeah, so starting with the citizens, and it does go two ways to your point about the candidates is like what it boils down to is really like streamlining the relationship between candidates and the candidates and the citizens. That citizens want an easier way to learn about their candidates, and kind of vice versa. Imagine if a politician, they could pull up their district and they could see where does my district stand on certain policy issues, where do they stand on immigration, where do they stand on healthcare, and actually know what your constituents want, and then actually start building your own policies based on what they want instead of being told from the top down of your party to be on certain policies. Um, so in multiple ways, we kind of want to replace, instead of door to door, imagine doing virtual town halls and virtual ways of just doing more, responding to messages um, through digital means. So just streamlining the communication, and it's kind of a win-win both for the candidate and the citizens, that citizens can ask the candidate questions, they could be part of polling, and so they'd have a way to share their voice to the candidates, and then on the flip side, the candidates know what their constituents want, and they don't have to, do all as much legwork. So it's really streamlining it from both sides, and is a win-win. Those that don't win are the ones that want it to be difficult, want to have to spend millions of dollars because they have the money to do it. But those that really want to do it for the right reasons are gonna really love this kind of a flip. But to get more into the citizen thing, it's citizen side, it's about streamlining democracy. Digital democracy will be a one-stop shop. Politician report cards is the thing that we're mentioning, that would showcase who funds their campaigns. And for those listening, one thing to be clear about funding is like it's actually public information. Like right now, you could go to opensecrets.org, and every state and federal politician is there. You could see their funding sources there. It's not super user friendly. We actually just spoke with them last 2 weeks ago. They're going to be updating it sometime middle of next year, but that's some of the data that we want to streamline into digital democracy, make it super user friendly, and also incorporate it with citizen data and reviews and a bunch of other stuff. But it is the bottom line is that is accessible information. It just needs to be a little bit more user friendly. Um, then we also want to make a candidate matchmaker, so you'd be able to say like, this is where I stand on policy issues, kind of like a dating service. This is where I stand on issues. This is this issue, like, this is where I stand on immigration. How important is that issue, from 1 to 5, and like, that kind of a thing. And then we'll show you, oh, this candidate's an 80% match. This person's a 60% match, and, so on and so forth. Um, so bottom line is like, the current system is overwhelming, and, you know, a lot of ways we just kind of wait till the general election, and then you're voting D down the line or R down the line. We want to make it more of an emphasis on the primaries. That's really where we get to select our candidates. That's really where we're the most manipulated, is kind of skipping over the primaries. And both the DNC and RNC kind of push their pick. They, before the primary even starts, they kind of know who they want to win, and they definitely know who they don't want to win, and they'll definitely still stack it against they'll stack it in favor of the ones they want to win. um but so we want to simplify this whole process, make it easier to understand who's running in the primary, who's running in the general, who's even third party and alternative candidates. We want to eventually allow for viability of other candidates to take root one day. um, and so this basically is all about it's about a candidate selection process, and simplifying, how do I decide who I want to vote for without spending insane amount of time and without a bunch of noise and drama and performative actions. So we're looking to drown out the noise and give you the substance of what these people are about. This is what they say they stand for, but then let's look into their history. What did they actually fight for once they're elected? Because a lot of the candidates, their big donors don't let them do all of what they promise they're going to do. That's usually one of their biggest things that kind of holds them back. Um, So in a nutshell, with the citizens, it's about simplifying that process, really empowering them with like factual information, all the information. It's easy to find the establishment pick of who to vote for, but like for the grassroots candidates or somebody that could possibly rise from nowhere, like it's hard to find their information. And then as you go, federal is easier, but then state and then local is even harder to look at information about candidates. So we're working on a pretty much a nationwide process of simplifying and streamlining this process and digitizing the process. And then real quick for the grassroots organizations and activism in general, kind of a simple treatment, the way we would have all politicians showcase equally. We want to start creating profiles for grassroots organizations, so that this one-stop shop, you could both find what candidates you want, that you want to be matched up with, what political organizations that you align with, that you want to support, and then even independent media, which we'll go in a little bit, is the third category. Um, but so we want to be able to help actually amplify grassroots efforts, help grassroots voices work with each other, work with candidates when they align. So some of the tools we're building is like kind of this matchmaking for activist to activist, activists with politicians, activists with citizens. So just different ways to match make and find common ground, and kind of separating it from the labels. Whether you identify as Democrat, Republican, socialists, or libertarian or whatever. We want to move it towards what actions you want to take, kind of more allow people to be more policy by policy. Like, okay, you say you're this, but why don't you just break down, like maybe on some things you're more left leaning, in some places you're more right leaning, in some places you're far left leaning. And so we have a process called clusters that probably wouldn't get into today, but that we have a way to kind of break down, how to match make between activists, candidates, and citizens, and what clusters you agree on. It's kind of like matchmaking based on policy stances to some extent. Um, so all in all, it gives grassroots orgs more visibility, and also tying them into this new digital political activism, a new way to spread word instead of just doing the typical like protest and call your senator. We want to like there's newer ways to take advantage of the digital age to spread awareness and influence and stuff like that. So that's all part of this, part of what we're doing, integrating all that kind of stuff.
Interesting. I think the part that really stuck out to me was towards the beginning of that answer. You were talking about citizens putting forth their actual policy views and concerns to candidates from the beginning. It sounded almost like a digital town hall. And I think I mean, obviously, you can't replicate the same thing as an in person town hall, but at least that would be another option for people to have, especially with how, depending on whichever party the wind's blowing against at a given time and what district you're talking about, you sometimes see a member of Congress just not bother to show up to their town hall because they're afraid of facing blowback. So at the very least, they wouldn't be able to, yeah, they wouldn't necessarily have a face-to-face interaction that would be very uncomfortable, but they're not going to be able to entirely run away from hearing from people when they don't want to hear from them. So I thought that part was a particularly interesting way that I haven't really I don't know if I've really heard of other people addressing. So that could also be a way to address any of these issues with town halls. So,
Mhm.
like you hinted at during that question. So, finally, what are 2 to 3 ways that you level the playing field for independent journalists?
Yeah, so independent media and journalists, it's actually the main categories. I've been working on this, like specifically FiNC as its current entity that it is today. Has been about 3 years I've been working on this. Now we have a team about 15 people. But so the independent media, though, the more I've been talking to different political orgs and reforms and citizens, the independent journalist side is the most separate from the political world of today. Um, like I talked to a lot of political orgs, and like they don't really think about connecting to independent media, and they're still kind of on this traditional, like, typical press releases to typical like establishment media, but not social media and independent journalists, podcasts. Um, so we found that that's the biggest potential of integrating that with the influence of, like, if you're a grassroots campaign and you don't have a ton of money, that there's really there's several issues, several downsides of being a grassroots candidate. One is just the money thing is going to be harder, but then two is that the establishment media is very biased against the grassroots candidates. The ones that are outside the box, they're not part of the status quo. The establishment media, they don't usually they don't want to promote you so much. They're going to be, if you're on their show, they're going to be very cynical. They're, with debates, they don't allow like the third parties in debates, and even in the primaries, it's very limited who could be on in a debate. So establishment media really shuts out alternative candidates and, real grassroots movements, candidates, and organizations, activists. And so what we're trying to build is a way for independent journalists to be the megaphone that the establishment media refuses to be. So we envision, maybe this, third party candidate or even a grassroots candidate in the Republican Party or Democrat Party can't get screen time on like MSNBC, but instead they get on like 10 independent media channels that, go on a couple podcasts, go on a couple, YouTube outlets. And so basically integrating independent journalists into what we're building is really an alternative political ecosystem. The way the establishment has their machine, we want to empower all grassroots efforts to kind of have their own tools, regardless, left, right, third party, whatever. We're again agnostic in that sense. But we want to empower them, give them a voice that can actually rival the establishment. So with independent media, we really want to connect journalists to these candidates that we keep talking about, the activist groups, kind of start building a network of independent, like a grassroots organization. If they align with a certain media and you guys feel like you could resonate, interview the organization on your media outlet. So like the journalists can give voices to these organizations, to the candidates, and basically kind of work together to grow both sides, both bases. And also, as these independent media, I mean, right now, podcasts are being super popular, especially millennial and Gen Z. We watch, we spend more of our news through podcasts and social media content rather than like watching like CNN or Fox or, we're way less in the traditional media sense, and we pull it from different places. And so we want to kind of take that to a new level where independent media can shape elections and feel like they're being a voice, a better voice, a more accurate voice than the establishment media. And we want to be clear, like, obviously there's good and bad independent media journalists. Some could be very partisan, some could be very biased, purpose lie. So I'm not saying they're all honest, but the key is like the establishment media, like one statistic that's really scary is there's about like 6 companies own 90% of the media on TV. So that's just 6 companies, speaks to tens of millions of people and constantly influencing what you see as reality. And so we want to flip it, that we want to encourage people to use independent journalists. Again, not saying which ones, that's for the citizens to decide, left, right, whatever. But the more, independent journalists, like the establishment media are selling a certain narrative. They have certain advertisers, they're part of a certain political system. So they are selling a certain narrative that they want us to believe, essentially. Not super conspiratorial, just generally greed, kind of can align with greed a lot easier than everyone else. Um, but but independent media, their incentive is to appease us as the followers, because they just need as many followers, viewers as possible, small dollar donations. Yeah, they have some advertisers, but it's more about like, feeding, like their customers, us, the citizens, not the advertisers. Um, and then also they're more accountable that, like, if independent media, like, if somebody lies on independent media, like, they get punished, like, publicly. They could get shunned, they could lose their career, like, in a lot of ways, they're held a lot more accountable than the establishment media, by the average person. So those are the reasons we encourage independent media. Um, so in a nutshell, we want them to be a megaphone for these alternative candidates, grassroots voices, political organizations, everything that's not part of the status quo. We want them to kind of interconnect that independent journalism should be the place to lift and work with them, and not so much the establishment media. Um, and then going back to digital democracy, DD, that'll also, once that's built, there'll be a whole section where independent media has a home there, where they could post all their content, their videos, their written content, and there'll be a rating system for citizens to gauge them, hold them accountable right there, and not demonetize them the way YouTube and others demonetize people that they deem too radical. They end up demonetizing. So, like, that, all that BS will be out, won't be involved. Um, so those are the main core ways that we want to bring it in. So it's really just, it's empowering independent media as part of an important part of the political ecosystem and an alternative political ecosystem, and then eventually incorporating them into the technology too.
I think also, and obviously, really fascinating points there about the accountability and the lessening the cost of access to these journalists for other people to reach out to them. But I imagine it's also just like we talked about with candidates and citizens and them making the research costs less onerous for them. I imagine it's also makes the researching job of independent journalists easier too, with this one-stop shop for all this information about where money is coming from and what candidates are saying about what and that sort of thing. And speaking of this cost of research, I think it's great to shine a light on more voices to give more people a seat at the table, but you can also run the risk of overwhelming voters with too much information, which can contribute to this overall ballot information problem. So, how do you make it so that voters don't feel so overwhelmed by whether it's the amount of choices they have or the amount of content they get about these candidates? How do you make sure that they feel like they can actually parse through all this information?
Yeah, definitely a really great question. I've actually been thinking about that a lot in the last couple weeks. That really, like, one of the biggest flaws with democracy as a whole is that there's too many choices, too overwhelming. Especially these days in our culture, we're very big on differentiating ourselves. So, like, you might agree 90% with this other person, you're going to change it 10%, but now you have your own separate thing, and, like, so now it's another choice. Um, and so I've been realizing a lot. That's why, like, some people, when they see, like, more authoritarianism and authority figures, like, oh, look, they could act, at least they make decisions. Democracy doesn't make decisions, because democracy, it's harder. You have to get a consensus, and, like, and then again, people just keep differentiating themselves too much. And so that's really at the core, though, of, like, the processes that we're talking about, of, like, how to kind of streamline the whole process. Part of it is that, just reading I have notes on this. So part of the process that we want to build is, first, and this works for choosing candidates. This will also work on, like, when people want to have, like, policy debates on our future system. When you're choosing really anything, any kind of solutions to the current problems that are going on. Um, First, we want to kind of show, like, what are all the choices. Then you want to start building consensus around certain choices, and then start eliminating choices. Um, and then, like, keep narrowing it down. So the best example, the most solid example would be, like, with the candidates specifically. So we're gonna have, probably not by the midterms, hopefully by the general election, having what we would call digital primaries. And so the idea is that, right now in our country, the campaign process is just so long these days. It's like, arguably anywhere between 1 to 2 years before an actual election. Um, so what we want to do is basically like, so imagine a year before the election is actually there, you're able to go on DD, you could start following digital democracy, and you could start following certain candidates that you like. And like, not everyone's going to do this a year ahead. Some people are going to wait till it gets a little bit closer, but basically have a way that early on see who's gaining traction, who's not, and then slowly start narrowing it down. There'll be certain contests that would happen to start, like, okay, who's like, 30 people are running now, like how do we cut that in half, like who's the 15 most popular, who has the most signatures or has the most, who's showing to be electable and viable and all that. Um and so long story short is there'll be different processes, like a candidate selection process over time, and the goal will be that by the primary we really want to narrow it down to like two to three candidates that are going to run in the general election. And this is assuming like there's going to be like an establishment Democrat and an establishment Republican, or at least one of them that's going to be in the general, that's not going to be necessarily devoted to this process. So we want all the grassroots candidates inside the two parties, even third parties, independents, everyone that's not part of the status quo. I mean, ideally the status quo too, just not expecting them in the earlier stages of this, running in this essentially a digital primary. And then go through like a candidate selection process. As we do the votes, it'd be like kind of like ranked choice voting, so citizens could choose their first, second, and third choice as this goes through. And so even as far as a year before, it starts slowly narrowing down like who's viable, who is resonating with the people, who's getting the support, not just financial support, but even just social media support and attention in general. Um, and so that's how we would do it for candidates. But then for all things, it's kind of like we want to first lay out your choices, but then really focus on consolidating choices. And like even with policy stances, like we're kind of thinking with the cluster idea that we have is like, so for healthcare, for example, in some ways there's 10, 20 different choices of how you could run healthcare, arguably even more than that. First we want to push it that when push comes to shove, maybe there's just really three choices. You either want like universal health care or Medicare for all type system, or you want private health insurance with one public option, or you want all private options but something that's more competitive that brings the pricing down. And so no matter what your ideas are, it has to fall into one of those three categories, and those are the three clusters that are related to healthcare. Then there can be subclusters. So subclusters of single payers, like, oh, well, how about this model of Medicare for all? Or how about this model of universal health care? Or how about we do what Canada is doing? So those would all have to be sub decisions, subclusters of that one cluster. Um, so long story short, it's like a way of consolidating and folding in that, oh, your idea is original, but like right now let's fold it into something that's more broad. Because like at the end of the day, most Americans, they just care about those three categories. Like if you're like, oh, do you want Medicare for all, you want the Australian model, you want this, they're like, I don't know, I just want Medicare for all. I don't know, let that go for the experts. So most people, we shouldn't have all those choices for most people. Only those that want to dig deeper should it get more granular. Um, so all this is all about like kind of how the process goes, how to organize the information and fold it into other information. And then like at the end of the day, like really have to push people to like, you have to put it into a standard. We can't have a million choices or we're never going to get anywhere. So things like have to get narrowed down at the end of the day. So it's going to kind of be fundamental to all these processes that we do.
Gotcha. Geez, the thought just left my head. I forgot exactly what it was. Oh, I was just gonna say there was that is a very tough balance to strike between providing too much information, providing too little information. I typically err on the side of giving too much information, but I mean, that's not always the proper solution either whenever I'm doing, whether it's an episode of this podcast by myself or a response to something somebody else says or something I write. So it's definitely a hard thing to come up with the absolute, this is the perfect solution. Of course, you can tweak it over time. We're running a
Mhm.
little low on time, so we'll try to get through the rest of these questions. So, what are 2 to 3 practical ways, and whether you want to take directly from what you've done with FiNC or in general, what are 2 to 3 practical ways we can do better in for anybody in pushing back against tribalism and polarization and incentivizing a more unified sense of purpose and action?
Sure. So one is really leaning into what I'm saying about this up-down politics and the system is being rigged. And like there's millions of people that are saying in a little bit of varied language, but really understanding that the fundamental issue, like most of the problems that we're dealing with right now is a symptom of the bigger problem. And the bigger problem is, the those that get elected are not fully representative of the people. It's not necessarily even their fault. It's just the system that we're in. As we've been talking about, you have to raise millions of dollars. You have to be in bed with the corporations. You have to be in bed with the party leaders. But it brought us to this extreme where, like, in some ways, the loudest voices are the ones that are heard. With mainstream media, though they lean towards the drama, they lean towards the fights and all that. And like so our system by design is kind of there to keep us divided, keep us divisive, keep us fighting. And a lot of ways to bring it together is seeing it as up versus down. I mean, right now, whether it's Trump right now or Biden before him, for at least a decade, the economy has been getting worse. People feel they're not doing as well as they used to. Even now they say about like 15-20% of Americans are feeling pretty good right now economically, but then a good 80% or more are still suffering. A lot of people argue that it's kind of since the Great Recession of 2008 is the last time like that the economy's never been back to the way it was back then. Um, so left or right, we're kind of feeling this same issue, and we're getting so focused on like this a certain policies that we want or like a strategy to get there. But if we actually focus on the system itself, that's something many people can agree with. Most Americans want money out of politics. Most Americans would want term limits on Congress. Most people don't like insider trading of Congress, that they can make millions of dollars in the stock market and play with their legislation to benefit. um so this up down politics idea is that like we can fight to be, most Americans don't feel heard. They feel like we're moving in the wrong direction economically, politically. And so, yes, we're going to fight over the policies. But if we talk about democracy and fixing, upgrading democracy, there's a lot we can line up together on, and understanding that a lot of people are in pain and economic pain and other forms of pain, and just we're fighting over what priority. Some people are looking at like the typical left type priorities versus right type priorities, but there's better ways to do it. And it's just that we're just stuck in this like extreme, because like we're one of the only first world countries that are in a two-party system. Most countries have multiple parties. A lot of times it might be two more major parties, but the third parties have a lot more power than in our country. So we're kind of stuck in this extreme piece. But like we if we focus on the system itself, focus on how do we make this more representative, how do we hold politicians accountable for their actions is a big one. Both sides would definitely agree with that kind of an issue. So that would actually heal a lot of the divide, get us more on the same page. I mean, that's what we're all about at FiNC is like that's the core issue is how we do democracy. And it hasn't upgraded to the digital age. It's still the same as it's been for decades. And like the rest of the world that we live in is in the digital age, but politics is so behind. Um, So that's the stuff that I would say is like that most people are in pain. There's a lot of things that we can all agree on, and it's yes, there's certain policy issues that we're not going to agree on, but it wouldn't feel as intense if we worked on fixing democracy and worked on these core issues of accountability in government, transparency in government. There'd be a lot more room for compromise between sides. Part of it's like you feel like you're not getting anything that you want, and then when you feel like that, you don't want to give up anything either. But like once we start feeling actual wins, the economy's getting a little bit better, and you're actually feeling it. If you got some wins on your side, you might be a little more open to compromising on another issue that might be a little less important to you. And so it all boils down to the system. Democracy at its core is meant to help sort out our differences. It knows we're not going to all agree, but there's a way to sort it out. It's just that our system is basically broken right now, and that's why it can't sort itself out. And so if we fix that system, all the other stuff would slowly kind of get in line and move us in the right direction.
I think you highlighted right there that the whole obviously a lot of the focus is on what is different about us, what divides us. You talked before about how people are so focused on differentiating themselves and then they get pissed off when people have even like a 5% difference in opinion from themselves, but that's neither here nor there. But the whole the goals that we have, the basic goals are ultimately the same. We want a working economy, we want to have our voices heard, we want to be safe, all these things. Obviously, we have different ideas of how to get there, but we at least focus on the fact that, okay, we do ultimately want the same results. Maybe we could be more likely to get somewhere. So one more big question, I guess I should say, before we get to the final stretch here. So I know you talk about more working with the system that we have, but you kind of touched on it already, of course, is some of the things that you either want to see changed or that you guys are actively working to change. So, what are 2 to 3 of the biggest rules about elections, campaigning, campaign finance, etc., that you want to see changed?
Sure. So first I want to preface that like that's the end goal. Like a lot of what we're doing is basically like the wolves of today are not going to lock their own cage. And so, most reform organizations, most of their existence is just about pushing legislation that sometimes can't happen. But we to your point, we do have like see it could be like 10, 20 years from now, but ultimately, definitely money in politics is number one. We would love to see like pretty much no money in politics eventually. Just everyone gets I guess a federal budget. Doesn't need to be so. The only reason it costs millions is because your opponent has millions of dollars. If everyone just had a much smaller budget, long as both sides, all the opponents had the same budget, they wouldn't need millions. It could be a lot cheaper. Um, but I would envision both like, DD would be the system where you showcase all the candidates and therefore shouldn't need that much campaigning outside of it. But in addition to that would be, yeah, that it would be just like kind of publicly funded campaigns, or at the very least, it's just small dollar only, no corporations that overturn Citizens United, the bill that said that corporations are human beings and that money is considered freedom of speech. That needs to go. Most Americans do not agree with that, and it was a horrible decision a little over a decade ago that happened. So like that would have to be overturned. So money in politics is definitely by far the number one. And then number two would be something about flexible voting, either ranked choice voting or proportional voting. Like even that being agnostic, we're kind of open to whichever one America ends up wanting is good to us. But we're still stuck in this. There's always the way our system works. The winner takes all always kind of forces us into a lesser of two evils, and not until we actually have like a ranked choice voting or proportional voting or star voting would change that forever. So as soon as something like ranked choice voting passes, it wouldn't be about winner takes all. You could have your first choice and second choice and third choice. So some form of flexible voting would be definitely our number two, and then the third would be like something that ends gerrymandering and politicians making their own districts. It should be, gerrymandering is a very undemocratic system, or process, regardless of who's working using it. So those would be our main legislation things.
Yeah, especially with you see all the redistricting efforts going on right now, which are, I mean, obviously it's about bolstering both parties' bases, and you don't have to be partisan or ideological to say that that is a bunch of BS. That is not something that should be happening. I mean, obviously, we can have some discussion about how to address campaign finance, but I think most people, even if they take the fact whether they're benefiting from gerrymandering out of the equation, I think we can all agree that gerrymandering is not something that you should be able to do. But any final thoughts you want to share on empowering citizens, leveling the playing field, or anything else we talked about today?
Yeah, so it's kind of, I guess, in brief, what we're doing, it really is unlike anything from the past. A lot of it's even hard just to kind of explain in a concise way. There's just a lot of moving parts to what we're doing. We're not a campaign, not a party, not a corporation. We're not even just a movement. We're calling it a movement of movements or a meta movement. But really, it's time to break the current rig patterns. We're still stuck in the same cycle again and again. Everyone has their typical Democrat or Republican talking points, and we're just going in a circle. And we're not moving the needle forward. We're not evolving as a society. Regardless, we are kind of culturally, you could argue, but not in politics. Regardless of, Democrats could have a majority in all chambers, Republicans could have a majority in all chambers, and yet things are not getting better. So it's clearly like we need to break the rig patterns in what we live in today. And we got to change our strategies of what we're doing. So, the more people learn about what FiNC is trying to do, and we're not doing it alone. We're trying to empower everyone that's in the grassroots, left, right, third party, activists, all the categories of political people. Anyone that's just not part of the core, multi-billion-dollar political machine is basically invited into this. And it's just about breaking the current patterns, building something more streamlined and actually more empowering and utilizes the digital age. Things need to move a lot faster than they do in the old political world. They need to move in the speed of the digital age. Um, and so it's time to change the game. And we could change the game without actually getting legislative change by just changing like how we decide who we vote for, and basically building this new system is a way to just kind of flip the script and flip things. So instead of like the party lead, like right now, the political process follows the party leaders and the parties and what they want to do, where we could flip it that the citizens are where everything revolves around the citizen, and where the citizen wants to move in what candidates and all that stuff. So all in all, definitely check us out. We're doing a lot of good things in the next couple of months. We're going to be launching our not digital democracy, but like kind of a stepping stone between there, to start really building this centralized shared stage and start empowering these different efforts. And people can join, add themselves as a member. You get basically put your name to be early access, to be a pre-owner of the digital democracy, so that when we do have that legal framework worked out, you'll be one of the first people to have an equal ownership stake of the platform. um, and everything seems very dark and divided these days, but there is this light. We can upgrade democracy. There is a lot that we all agree on, and we all feel we're not moving in the right direction. And we gotta move from this left right distraction. Like, yes, there's a lot to that part, but it's still a lot of it's a distraction. And if we work at the core of the issues, we can work this all out, and we could really start healing the divide, and finding common ground on fixing the system itself, and then everything else will just kind of follow after that.
Well, there's a succinct way to put that. So thank you very much for those final thoughts. And there you go for those of you who are listening at home. So now let's get into the very end of this podcast. So for those of you who are new to the podcast, whenever I have guests on, I like to have a random, fun, non-political question of the day just to round things out, give another side of the guests, and variety is the spice of life after all. So Travis, today's random question of the day for you is, and I'm not sure if, I mean, you don't really need to be a sports guy for this question, but if you're a professional athlete like a boxer or a baseball player, what would be your entrance music?
That's a really hard one for me. Like kind of like a theme song kind of thing.
Yeah, basically like a theme song. So like when a baseball player comes up to home plate getting ready to bat, or a boxer comes into the ring, they have a song that always plays whenever they enter.
Yeah, that's a really hard one for me actually.
Well, if you want,
um,
I'll answer mine first if you need some time. So,
let's go.
I mean it would definitely be a more of a heavy metal hard rock song. I'm not sure if you listen to him, but my favorite musician is Jerry Cantrell. He's also part of Alice in Chains, and he actually just last year came out with an album called I Want Blood. And so the title song from that album is right now is what would be my entrance music. So definitely check out I Want Blood if that's the kind of music that you're into, that hard rock, heavy metal stuff, if for those of you at home who are into that kind of thing. So did I give you enough time, Travis?
Yeah, it's still gonna be a really hard one. I don't know what like
How about
when
just pick what is one song, not necessarily the song, but what is one song you think would be very good that would fit you?
um I don't know. It'd be
Oh
I
man,
guess
I picked a really hard question. I'm sorry.
yeah, for me I'm weird with songs and stuff. Like, I don't know, the only thing I'm popping up in my head is Bittersweet Symphony by, is it The
Oh,
Verve?
yeah, Verve,
Right.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good song. I like that
yeah,
song a lot.
yeah, so, I don't know why that's coming to my head, like, it but, I don't know, like, I don't know if the mood of it would necessarily match, the whole question that you said, but yeah, I
That's
guess
all
that
right.
song
That's
resonates.
some people don't necessarily need something like super hardcore pumping them up or anything. Sometimes
Yeah.
that's a good song though. I like that. It's not. I mean, it's not wouldn't fit me for entrance music, but I guess it'd be very bittersweet for somebody to be able to encounter you and say, "Oh my goodness, it's Travis Misurell," and then you beat them to a pulp in the ring, or you take them yard in a baseball game. But well, there you go. So Bittersweet Symphony by The Verve. Yeah. If you haven't heard that song, that's a good one too. Definitely a lot different than I Want Blood by Jerry Cantrell, but it's a very good song. That is going to wrap things up for today. Obviously, I'll add some links in my show notes for you. But is there any, besides Futures Now Coalition, any other links you want to share?
No, so it's just gonna be futureis.org is our website, and then most of our handles are at futureis.org. Our main ones are TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Blue Sky, and there's a couple others that are on our you can see on our website too.
Okay. Well, I'll add those in the show notes. And then for my show notes, my Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my LinkedIn, which I post on quite frequently, my medium.com profile, my educational email course for 5 days about how we can more effectively mitigate political polarization, which is free for you to sign up for. My book on political independence on Amazon, ebook and paperback format, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. But that is going to wrap it up for today's episode. So thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.